As Brazil's leader becomes the latest in the country to test positive for the virus, we're asking, has the coronavirus crisis dented President Bolsonaro's popularity? This is Coronavirus, the latest from the Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis. Brazil is one of the global hotspots of the pandemic. The world's sixth most populous nation has seen over 1.6 million cases and more than 65,000 deaths. And its far-right leader, Jair Bolsonaro, confirmed on Tuesday that he too had tested positive and was suffering mild symptoms.
Deu positivo. Agora, como é que isso tudo aconteceu? Vale a pena
It's a development seized on by critics as comeuppance for his history of downplaying the disease. He suggested the virus is nothing more than a media trick from which he has nothing to fear as a former athlete. So to discuss President Bolsonaro's aversion to lockdown measures and the effect the crisis is having on his leadership, I gave Euan Marshall a call. He's a journalist covering the story from São Paulo. And we started by talking about President Bolsonaro's history of understating the effects of the virus.
Well, it's interesting because, as you mentioned, he's referred to the disease in the past as a little flu. And he suggested, when he said he would only get mild symptoms, that was because of what he calls his past as an athlete. I'm not sure how much truth is in that. But what was interesting today when he announced the results is that for the first time, he acknowledged that he is a part of the risk group for COVID-19 because, he's age 65. So we'll have to see exactly how that pans out in terms of his own attitude towards his own health. But he stressed several times today that he is feeling well. He also said that he would like to even go for a walk. He feels comfortable and healthy enough to do these sorts of things. So we'll just have to see over the next couple of days exactly how his condition progresses and exactly what his attitude towards it will be.
I think it's fair to say, Euan, that I detect some scepticism in your voice about the idea of Bolsonaro's athletic past protecting him from coronavirus. But there is something else now that he thinks might well protect him, isn't there, Euan?
Yeah, so since Sunday, since he began to run a fever, he has said that he consulted with his doctors and they administered hydroxychloroquine, which is the anti-malarial drug which has been touted by some, including Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro himself, as a kind of potential cure for COVID-19. So he claims that he's been taking that ever since and that he credits the hydroxychloroquine with an improvement in his symptoms. He says that he has a lower fever, that his cough is less intense, and Bolsonaro since the beginning has been all in on hydroxychloroquine. He has loosened all sorts of regulations in Brazil for this to be administered to all coronavirus patients, whether they be severe or mild. He suggests that the palliative use of the medication would actually be really useful, as in even just preventive use of hydroxychloroquine, suggesting that everyday people should just be taking it to prevent them from getting coronavirus. So this is potentially another platform for Jair Bolsonaro over the next few days to advertise for the effectiveness of the drug, which, as we know in the rest of the world, a lot of these scientific studies are coming out with no conclusive proof as to its efficacy. But Jair Bolsonaro himself seems to be very much convinced.
Now, for most of the announcement today, he was wearing a mask. He did then back up away from the journalists and take off his mask. He's been critical of all lockdown measures, but he's also been critical of mask wearing, hasn't he?
Yeah, in particular mask wearing, actually. Just a few days before he fell ill, he vetoed new legislation which would make it mandatory for everyone in Brazil to wear masks in public spaces. He changed that law, making it no longer mandatory to use masks in churches, in shops, and in prisons. And there was a number of different little exceptions that he put in there. And he's attended lots of these public events without using a mask. He's been shaking hands with his supporters. He's shown, no regard for these sorts of hygiene measures. And as you mentioned, they're taking off his mask at the end of the press conference. That's par for the course with Bolsonaro. That's what you get with him.
Now, his message has always been that he wants a return to normality and he wasn't in favour of any of the lockdown measures or mask wearing, as you say. But he doesn't actually have direct control over the opening and indeed the closing of states. That's done by state governors in Brazil, isn't it? So how much is he seen to be to blame for the 65,000 plus deaths in the country?
Right, yeah. So Bolsonaro obviously cannot decree that certain states or cities should be under lockdown. He cannot open up businesses by decree either. As you say, that's all done by these state and municipal governments. But when you have the maximum authority of the country on national TV, on social media, telling everyone that everything's okay, that you don't need to wear a mask, that social distancing is not effective, then it's going to have an effect on the population as a whole, certainly among his supporters. And, since the start of the pandemic, he has been adamant that everyone has to go back to work, that the economy cannot stop, that social distancing is not going to make a difference, especially amongst younger populations. And he doubled down on that today, actually, when announcing that he had tested positive for the coronavirus. He suggested that himself, being slightly older, would have to take some care, but that the young people of Brazil really shouldn't have to worry that much about the disease, that their chance of being severely ill because of COVID-19 was very low against all scientific results that we've seen. And, so it's more of the same from Bolsonaro, really.
Is there any kind of test and trace system up in place in Brazil? We saw these pictures of Bolsonaro at Independence Day, US Independence Day celebrations last weekend, where there wasn't social distancing in the group that he was in, and they weren't wearing masks. Do we know what the implications of that might be?
Well, to answer your first question, contact tracing really hasn't been brought in Brazil at all. There have been some small instances of it being carried out in really kind of small municipalities, to certain degrees of effectiveness. But, on a large scale, that's not happening at all. In fact, the testing levels in general are really low in Brazil. At the moment, until very recently, you had to be in a severe condition in hospital before you would even receive a coronavirus test, which is, that's slightly changed now, but that gives you an idea of just how few people are being tested here. In relation to Bolsonaro over the weekend meeting the US ambassador at a Independence Day celebration in Brasilia, the ambassador in question has been now tested for coronavirus. The results haven't been released, but they are now going back through all of the people who Bolsonaro has been with over the last few days, including several cabinet ministers, and they're all receiving tests. So, we just have to wait and see exactly how far that's spread amongst the president's inner circle.
We've spoken a lot about Bolsonaro's behaviour. Has that behaviour dented his popularity amongst the Brazilian population?
Well, it has and it hasn't. Jair Bolsonaro has a kind of 20% constituency amongst the Brazilian population of people who are loyal supporters of the president. They will be behind him no matter what he says or does from here on out. But there's also, before the pandemic, there was a kind of 20-30% of the population who might side with him. They didn't really dislike him that much. But now his rejection rates are much higher. It's essentially those 20% of the population who are in his favour, and then the other 80% who basically want rid of him. But when you have 20% of the population behind you, that is, in Brazil, it's enough for you to hold on. It's enough for you to develop some form of constituency and to govern. So his popularity has been dented, but not amongst his key supporters.
The rest of the coronavirus latest news. Homeowners will be given vouchers to pay for insulation and double glazing as part of a multi-billion-pound job creation drive in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak will use his summer economic update on Wednesday to unveil a £3 billion scheme he says will create thousands of new jobs and support tens of thousands more by stimulating demand for green home improvements. Downing Street's rejected calls for Boris Johnson to apologise after he said too many care homes didn't really follow procedures over coronavirus. Labour called the comments crass and said government advice to care homes had been conflicting. But Number 10 said the Prime Minister had been pointing out that not enough was known about the virus in the early stages of the outbreak. The latest figures suggest 20,000 care home residents have died with the virus in England and Wales since March. Melbourne's 5 million residents will be under a strict lockdown as of midnight on Wednesday after the state of Victoria saw 191 new coronavirus cases on Tuesday. The measures will be in place for 6 weeks. The announcement came as residents of the Australian state prepared for their northern border with New South Wales to be sealed for the first time in more than a century. If you'd like to read more detail on any of those stories, as always, you'll find links in the episode description. Don't forget that listeners can access all of our coronavirus coverage, plus the rest of our news, sports, fashion, culture, and much, much more, completely free for 30 days. Go to telegraph.co.uk/audio. This is Coronavirus, the latest from the Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis. Stay subscribed to this feed to make sure you don't miss my next update.